It didn't roar onto the scene with chrome, lights, or flashy campaigns. It didn't have a cult following like a Scania 143 or the same prestige as a Volvo F12. But if you walked into any British haulage yard in the early 90s, odds are, tucked between a few polished ERFs and Stobart Scania rigs, you'd find it. The MAN F90, quiet, understated, but everywhere. Like a reliable background character that never missed a line, this truck quietly earned its place in UK transport history. Not by shouting, but by showing up day in and day out. MAN wasn't new to the scene, but the F90 was different. Launched in the late 1980s, this truck didn't try to reinvent the wheel. It just made the wheel a whole lot more reliable. Built with German precision and designed to last, it didn't come dressed in frills. It came with guts, the kind of guts British fleet managers loved. And in an industry where breakdowns meant missed deadlines and missed deadlines meant lost contracts, the F90 became the weapon of choice for companies that needed machines to just get on with it. It didn't matter if you were hauling bottled water down the M5, livestock through Welsh hills, or frozen chips into Scotland. The MAN F90 didn't flinch. With its chunky lines, slab-fronted cab, and tough-as-nails chassis, it looked like it was carved out of a concrete block. There was nothing elegant about it. And that's exactly why it worked. This wasn't a beauty pageant truck. This was a workhorse. And British haulage firms weren't interested in trucks that looked good parked up. They needed something that would survive potholes, tight turns, overloaded trailers, and a driver that had been awake since 3 a.m. But here's the thing, it wasn't just tough. The F90 was smart too. MAN packed it with tech that mattered. Not the gimmicky, fragile stuff that breaks in winter, but intelligent engineering that made life easier on the road. The cab was one of the first to really think about driver comfort. Spacious, with decent insulation, simple controls, and suspension that didn't rattle your fillings loose every time you hit a bump on the A14. Drivers who spent 10 to 12 hours behind the wheel actually started to like these things. That's no small feat in an era where most cabs were either freezing or boiling with no middle ground. Under the bonnet, the F90 offered a range of torquey diesel engines that weren't flashy on paper but pulled like mules. The D28 inline 6 became the bread and butter of the series, and it delivered exactly what fleet operators wanted: decent power, great economy, and the kind of reliability you could build a business on. These engines weren't about top speed or noise. They were about hauling 40 tons of goods across Britain without skipping a beat, and doing it every single day. The sleeper cab, built for business. You didn't get mahogany trim or a minibar. You got a bed that was actually usable, space to move around, and storage that didn't feel like an afterthought. The whole vibe of the F90 was practical. You'd find oil-stained gloves tossed on the passenger seat, a CB radio hanging loose, maybe a crusty sandwich from Watford Services wedged behind the dash. But everything inside that cab had a purpose, and it never let you down. And then there was the price. That's where MAN won over the yard bosses. The F90 undercut its rivals, often by just enough to make a fleet buyer pause. Do we really need another 143? Or can we get 2 of these MANs instead and have change left over for tires? Over time, more and more companies did the math, and the F90s started to flood the yards. You'd see convoys of them, gray or white or red, with hastily painted fleet logos on the door, and trailers full of steel, timber, or supermarket stock rattling behind them. These weren't trucks that made headlines. They didn't win show and shines. But if you were a driver in the 90s trying to earn a living, you started to notice them. You started to drive them. And slowly they started to grow on you. Maybe it was the way they didn't break down. Maybe it was the way they didn't rattle like your old ERF. Or maybe it was just the fact that when you fired it up at 4 in the morning and pulled out of the yard, it felt like it had your back. And so the MAN F90 became a backbone of British logistics. Not glamorous, not loud, just consistent, just tough, just there, in the background, holding up half the country's transport while other trucks got all the glory. If you know, you know. The real legend of the MAN F90 didn't come from flashy ads or record-breaking stats. It came from the stories whispered across service bays and driver lounges. The kind where a driver tells you he took one up a mountain in Wales during a snowstorm and brought it back down without so much as a warning light blinking. The kind where a fleet manager points to one that's done 800,000 miles, still running strong on the original gearbox. These weren't exaggerations, these were everyday occurrences. And that's where the F90 quietly built its cult cult following, not with fanfare, but with flawless repetition. You could always tell when a fleet ran F90s. The yard looked busier, trailers were constantly moving, the trucks didn't sit around waiting on parts or electrical diagnostics. They rolled in, they fueled up, they rolled out. Simple as that. Mechanics like them too. Fewer electronics meant fewer headaches. You didn't need a laptop with a dozen cables to figure out what was wrong. A good ear, a few tools, and maybe a Saturday morning was all it took. That meant less downtime and more miles, which in haulage is the difference between a decent month and a disastrous one. Drivers came and went, but the F90s stuck around. They weren't babied or kept spotless. They were used, and you could see it, from the worn-out driver seats to the dented bumpers and hand-painted fleet numbers on the doors. These trucks didn't live showroom lives. They lived motorway lives. Rain, sleet, salt, roadkill, you name it. They ate it for breakfast, and they just kept going. There's a kind of respect that builds when a machine takes abuse and still doesn't complain. The F90 earned that respect by being the last one to leave the yard and the first one back in line for the next load. Even when newer trucks started creeping in, more modern MANs, aerodynamic Volvos, and Scanias with creature comforts, a lot of fleet bosses held onto their F90s. They'd retire the newer trucks first. Seriously, why? Because the newer stuff had too many sensors, too many points of failure, too many mornings wasted on software errors. Meanwhile, the old F90s, they just started up and got to work. Sure, they weren't as smooth, they weren't as quiet, but they got the job done with zero fuss. That's what mattered most when deadlines were tight and profits thinner than a service station coffee. Some drivers swore by them, wouldn't drive anything else. Even when offered newer trucks, they'd ask for the old man with the long legs, because it pulled better uphill, because they knew how to fix it if something went wrong, because they liked how it felt when it rumbled under load, gears clicking in like clockwork. It wasn't about luxury, it was about trust. The kind of trust you don't develop overnight, the kind of trust that builds over hundreds of hours behind the wheel. And then there were the little things, the quirks only drivers knew, like how the heater took a minute, but once it kicked in, it could roast your boots, or how the gear stick felt like moving a crowbar through gravel, but somehow it was always satisfying, the way the doors closed with a heavy industrial thunk, or how if you timed the shift just right, that engine would purr like it actually enjoyed the abuse. These weren't just machines, they had character, they had presence. Even in the twilight of their working years, F90s found new lives. Some went overseas to Eastern Europe and Africa, where they hauled cargo across rough terrain. Others stayed in the UK, passed down to smaller firms or owner-operators who knew exactly what they had. A few even made it to shows, restored, polished, and given the love they never got during their peak years. Funny how trucks only get appreciated once they're no longer essential. And today, if you spot an F90 still on the road, it'll likely be on light duty. Maybe hauling farm equipment, doing local runs, or parked up on a Sunday show field next to an old ERF. But to the ones who knew them, the sight of that square cab and no-nonsense face still hits a nerve. It reminds them of long shifts, no sat-nav, handwritten route plans, and steaming mugs of tea and freezing laybys. It reminds them of a time when trucks didn't need to be pretty, just dependable. The MAN F90 never asked for attention. It never needed it. It just kept moving loads, making miles, and quietly earning the loyalty of everyone who stepped up into the cab. And if that's not the mark of a true haulage legend, nothing is.